So welcome. It's a very special day for us to welcome back Timothy Garton. Some of you may recall a wonderful talk he gave here a couple of years ago. He doesn't need an elaborate introduction. He is one of the preeminent intellectuals and chronicler of our times. Although these just might seem a little bit of deja vu when you're writing about Eastern Europe in different ways. His most recent book, and one I'd particularly mention in this audience, is an absolutely magnificent book on free speech, published by Yale University Press. And he's this evening doing a dialogue kind of based on that book and theme at the Vidhi Legal Center at 6:30 at IIC, in case any of you are interested, with Gautam Bhatia. So it should be quite a wonderful conversation. The only other thing I'll say about sort of Timothy, that I think yesterday it was announced, or day before, that he's the recipient of this year's Charlemagne Prize, which is one of the most prestigious prizes for a scholar, or for that matter, anybody sort of upholding the best of European values and the idea of Europe. And the one thing I liked in the citation was it describes him as somebody who defies populists. Did you notice that one? Which was so we are, really delighted and honored to have him here. And he's been on a heroic role. He's just done 3 panels at Jaipur. So deeply appreciate him taking the time out. And we thought we'd just sort of use this as an opportunity to reflect about Brexit, Europe, and you can't think of a better person. So welcome, Timothy.
Thank you very much.
Congratulations on the prize.
Thank you. I must say, it is rather humbling to receive a prize won by Churchill, de Gasperi, Monet, Schumann, and the last winner was the Pope. So it's clearly downhill this year. But it is humbling, and it connects very much to this topic, because is the audio working properly? Yeah, because I'm sure that one of the thoughts in their mind was that Britain is still in Europe, and you may know, some of you, that I began my Guardian article the day after the Brexit vote, saying that Britain can no more leave Europe than Piccadilly Circus can leave London, which is clearly true, and which is why, it's in a sense the most fundamental reason why this vote is an act of monumental folly, to make my own position clear from the start, because Britain has always been part of Europe. It always has been dragged back in to the disorders and conflicts and indeed wars on the continent. So the idea that Britain can somehow detach itself from European affairs is a profound illusion. I actually also wrote the day after that the 9th of November 1989, the day of the fall of the Berlin Wall, had been the best day of my political life, and the 23rd of June 2016 was the worst. And I mean it. I don't mean to compare it in scale to the fall of the Berlin Wall, but for me personally. However, what I'm going to do in this talk is sine ira ac studio, that's to say, not to be too partisan, above all to explain the causes of this vote, because that's what we do know, and then to say something about what interests diplomats and policymakers, namely what might happen tomorrow, which is, of course, what we don't know. And so, of course, we all spend a great deal of time talking about what we don't know rather than about what we do. But nonetheless, I'll say a thing or two about that. So let me start with the causes. And the first thing to say about the causes of Brexit: this was anything but inevitable, anything but what social scientists call overdetermined. We should avoid what Henri Bergson called the illusions of retrospective determinism, the all too persuasive belief that what happens somehow had to happen, and therefore your job is only to explain it. This was anything but predetermined. It was very close, 52% of 48 to 48, roughly, percent of those who turned out to vote. And the picture I use is of a layer cake. I identify 14, no less than 14 layers of causality, from the most profound to the most contingent and conjunctural. And I would argue that any one or two of those causes, including the most conjunctural and contingent, had gone the other way, the result would probably have gone the other way. So what I'm going to do is to go through those causes very quickly, because I think it's interesting to examine them all. Obviously, they're weighted differently. We can discuss the weighting. Now, and as I say, there are 14, so I'm going very fast. 1 a minute. Jules Michelet, the great French historian, used to begin his lectures on British history by saying, Messieurs, l'Angleterre est une île. Ladies and gentlemen, or actually he only said gentlemen, England is an island, which is of course untrue. England is not an island, Britain is an island, but nonetheless, the most fundamental claim would be being an island makes us different. And this claim, while it obviously has a grain of truth in it, I think is fundamentally false, because for many centuries of its history, England and then Britain saw itself as part of a transcontinental polity. Actually, until the fall of Calais in the 16th century, Britain, or England precisely, had territory on the continent of Europe. And even in the supposed era of splendid isolation, a phrase coined by Lord Salisbury, that same Lord Salisbury said, "We are part of the community of Europe and must do our duty as such," end quote, said Lord Salisbury. So this is something of a myth. The second possible explanation is empire, one that will be familiar to you here. And I think there is some truth in that in three separate senses. First of all, there was in some of the rhetoric of the Brexiteers, Michael Gove, Boris Johnson, Andrew Roberts, the historian of empire, the rather rose-tinted historian of empire, with whom I was actually on a panel at Jaipur on Brexit, there was what I call nostalgic optimism. Nostalgic optimism. Michael Gove actually said in his article announcing that he was for Brexit, "Who says we can't be all right on our own? We once governed the greatest empire the world has ever seen, so clearly we can, manage it fine on our own." Complete non sequitur, of course. Because we were great months, it can't. Because I was rich once, that doesn't mean I can be rich again. It doesn't follow. But it played a part. Secondly, the identification with the Anglosphere, the English-speaking world, Canada, the United States, the former Commonwealth, did play a part. I took part in a debate many years ago on the motion, the Channel is wider than the Atlantic. I was arguing that it wasn't. I lost, overwhelmingly. One of the debaters on the other side was Michael Gove, so that played a part. But there's a third sense which is more interesting and less familiar, which is the sense of empire in its original English meaning, not of colonies overseas, but of legal sovereignty. The 1533 Act in Restraint of Appeals to Rome under Henry VIII says famously, quote, "This realm of England is an empire." And that didn't mean we have territories overseas, it meant we had total legal sovereignty. And this sense of legal sovereignty is peculiar to Britain, or more precisely to England historically, and feeds into my third causal factor, which is our very particular notion of absolute parliamentary sovereignty. And the case for democratic self-government is, in my view, the most honourable and respectable case for Euroscepticism. Many of my friends have been Eurosceptics for 30 or 40 years on these grounds. My own father, who died 2 years ago, who was of the great wartime generation of English who, fought through the Second World War, he was a passionate Eurosceptic, and when I argued with him, which I did often, We once gave him for Christmas a chocolate euro, which he ate with great pleasure, I have to say, gnawing his way through the chocolate euro. But for him, this was the most fundamental argument. We should govern ourselves. And so that was very important. And in the polling, it's important to note, on average, roughly 25% of those asked gave this as either the main reason or one of the main reasons. The fourth reason is that we came late to the European community. We only joined in the early 1930s, and unlike most of our continental partners who came to it with a deep motivation that came from the experience of war, dictatorship, fascist or communist, occupation, defeat, collaboration, we came to it not with those experiences, but essentially out of the experience of relative economic decline. This was a key motive, and our approach to it, not mine, but ours collectively, was transactional, fundamentally transactional. It's good for us if it's good for us economically and politically in terms of our role in the world, but above all economically. So if the continental European economy is doing badly, as it is of late, seen as doing worse than us, because of the Eurozone crisis above all, then that balance of advantage changes. That feeds into a fifth reason, which is that British governments, essentially for more than 30 years, not at the very beginning, but for more than 30 years, have not made the case for Europe to our own publics. Linton Crosby, the Australian political technologist who advised David Cameron, used to say, "You can't fatten a pig on market day." Well, British leaders have been not fattening the pig for 30 years, and then suddenly come market day, they tried to fatten the pig. It was too late. And in particular, since Margaret Thatcher, and I think Margaret Thatcher is almost a cause in her own right, she's sort of 5B, we have had the Eurosceptical narrative relayed through two generations of conservative politicians and journalists, many of whom genuinely believe it. But it's a self-reinforcing echo chamber of Tory politicians and journalists. Margaret Thatcher famously said in her book on statecraft, I quote, "Most of the problems the world has faced have in one fashion or another come from mainland Europe, and most of the solutions from outside it." A slightly dubious historical interpretation, but never one, but one very much signed up to by, as I say, these two generations of conservative publicists to whom Boris Johnson and Michael Gove and Thatcher's biographer Charles Moore belong. And that brings me to my sixth factor, which is the extraordinary power to shape the narrative and the news cycle in Britain of the Eurosceptic press. This is unique to Britain. 70 to 80% of the coverage, if you combine, as it were, bias and reach, because these are the most influential papers, The Sun, the Daily Mail, hugely influential, the Daily Telegraph in particular, have been pushing a Eurosceptic narrative since the time of Margaret Thatcher, with columnists Charles Moore, Michael Gove, Boris Johnson, but also, crucially in their news coverage, bad journalism building on bad history. And their bias was spectacular in the course of the referendum campaign. You will know this very well. Just a couple of examples. I don't know if I have it with me, but the front page of The Sun with a full-page portrait of Her Majesty, Queen backs Brexit. There was no solid sourcing for this story. Her Majesty would ask questions at a private lunch. She would never say a word about her own opinion, except in perhaps to Prince Philip in bed on this subject. Queen backs Brexit. They were actually had their knuckles rapped even by the feeble independent press regulator, self-regulator, but then they get it again because Her Majesty was reported as asking over a lunch, give me 3 reasons for Brexit, which is the kind of thing you might say in a private lunch. Let me try and understand. Banner headline, give me 3 reasons for Brexit, picture of the Queen. Sorry, ma'am, says the Sun, we can't give you 1. Which is rather brilliant journalism, but deeply prejudicial. Focus group work shows that the 3 people whom the British public most want, the great British public most would want to hear from on this subject were the Queen, so the Sun told them what the Queen thinks, Martin Lewis, who is a much listened to financial journalist, actually a brilliant financial journalist who was clearly for Remain, and I'm sorry to say, David Beckham. But anyway, the Queen spoke through the pages. And this is sort of the British part of the post-fact society about which we're all talking, because narrative prevailed over evidence. A famous line from the campaign was Michael Gove's, the people in this country have had enough of experts, right? And it is true that all the balance of economic opinion did not prevail. I think the BBC, frankly, did rather a poor job in that respect, and the narrative prevailed. 7th reason, individuals. Individuals matter in history. And it matters spectacularly in this case that the 2 individuals I've already mentioned 2 or 3 times, Boris Johnson and Michael Gove, came out for Brexit. They could have gone the other way. In private, Boris Johnson, his whole family is for remaining in the EU. Frankly, I don't think he gives a damn. I think he cares about Boris Johnson. He himself said that he'd been swinging around like a shopping trolley before the vote. But then he decided, for reasons I could explain in the discussion, and within a few days he was saying that the EU is like being in prison. And we see the sunlit uplands through the door of the jail, and we're going out. And fundamentally, he treated it like an Oxford Union debate. And I'm sorry to say, because it's rather shaming for British democracy, that ultimately this became an Oxford Union debate about 2 old Etonians about who would become Prime Minister. Right? The Boris and Dave show. This is not just an assertion, because we at Oxford, in the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, did a serious study of the media coverage of the referendum. And the largest single chunk of coverage, 14%, was about David Cameron versus Boris Johnson. Blue on blue, as the phrase is, Tory on Tory. And that's, of course, a parody of what this sort of great debate about the future of the country and Europe should be about, but that's what it came down to. We're back in the world of Anthony Trollope in 2016. Reason number 8 connects closely to that, and I'm moving, as you will see, in a sense from structural to contingent reasons on the British side, is the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn only got 4% of the coverage against 14% for Boris versus Dave. I do think it's plausible to speculate that if Labour had had a much stronger and more popular leader, a man who could really speak to the working class, as a leader of Labour should, who had been strongly for Remain, that could have swung it the other way. We had a very weak populist, hard-left leader, Jeremy Corbyn, who historically had always been a Eurosceptic. And that absent voice was incredibly important, because instead of being Boris versus David Cameron, the Prime Minister versus the Labour leader, it became Boris versus Dave. My 9th reason, and again here I move across the channel to the continent, is that we got a very bad deal. If the deal had been a bit better on the crucial issue, which was immigration, if, for example, we had had an emergency break permitted for national governments on immigration, again, I think it could have gone the other way. And the irony here is, if the Brexit vote had come a year later, because the refugee crisis has lifted the issue of the salience of the issue of migration so far up the German agenda, I think Germany, crucially, would have gone for an emergency break, because Germany is so key to all of this. And again, it might have been one. The 10th reason, and this connects to the deal but is in a sense a separate reason, is that because Britain had been such an awkward customer since the time of Margaret Thatcher, I want my money back. Remember her famous phrase in the 1980s, I want my money back. Since we'd been such an awkward customer for so long, the stock of goodwill towards Britain among our European partners was very much diminished, and had been further diminished by the David Cameron government, which had been an even more awkward customer on many trivial matters. So when it comes to the negotiation, it really matters how much goodwill you have. And despite the great work of many very able British diplomats, I have to say, who were terrific at cultivating connections, including Ivan Rogers, who just recently resigned as the UK's representative in Brussels, the political goodwill was very small. Interesting comparison. Compare and contrast how little Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, has been criticized, despite the fact that he's turned his country into, at best, an illiberal democracy, if not a nearly authoritarian regime. Very little criticism. Why? Because he's played the European game brilliantly. He kept his party inside the European People's Party, which is by far the largest and most important groupings of centre-right parties in Europe, French, Spanish, Angela Merkel, all in there, and he's been terrifically cooperative. Compare and contrast David Cameron, who, say what you will, has not turned Britain into an illiberal democracy, but took the Conservatives out of the EPP, has been very unhelpful on many issues of interest to other governments. That's what you get. I now turn to 3 reasons which, in a very interesting way, in my view, go back to that greatest day of my political life, the 9th of November 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I think this connection is really interesting for a historian, because it shows you how the seeds of disaster can be sown in the moment of triumph. So 3 things, I think, in some important sense, can be dated back to that memorable day when the Berlin Wall came down. So my 11th reason, if you're counting. The most obvious one is very simply that it opened the door to the end of Soviet domination of Central and Eastern Europe. Those countries transitioned to democracy, and therefore they're joining the European Union mainly in May 2004. And since Europe was in optimistic, indeed triumphant mode at that time, it was seen as self-evident that that included the 4 freedoms of EU membership: the freedom of movement of goods, services, capital, and people. Given the freedom of movement, the people came. And they came most of all to Britain and Ireland, actually, but most of all numerically to Britain. To Germany too, but over a longer period. Something like 2.2 million, give or take. It's difficult to say because you don't count EU citizens going in and out. Something like 2.2 million East Europeans over 10 years. That's a hell of a lot of people, on top of a lot of immigration from outside Europe. I campaigned for the Remain campaign on the streets of East Oxford, the mean streets of East Oxford. They're not so mean, but they do have a very large immigrant population. And person after person on the doorstep would say, oh, there are just too many of these bloody foreigners. And then I said, who do you mean? Oh, the Poles and the East Europeans. Because Britain has a very generous welfare state, this wasn't just about jobs, it was about healthcare, overcrowded hospitals, housing, education. And this is a reality. It is a lived reality of many of these voters. It's quite wrong to dismiss them as racist or xenophobic. Amusingly, often they were Pakistani or Asian British shopkeepers and workers, many of them Muslim. So it's a certain irony that for the Muslim British, so well integrated in British society, that for them the bloody foreigners were white Christian Europeans. I do think there's a certain irony in that. In a sense, it's an ironic tribute to the success of British integration, but this was a huge reason, probably the single biggest reason for the vote, was the resentment of East European immigration and all the ills that were attributed to it, which is a separate point. My 12th reason, this is a second flowing from 1989, is the Eurozone and its discontents. This is a very interesting separate story. I have now read with close attention most of the documents, American, British, and German. The French are being a little bit slow in publishing theirs, for reasons we could talk about. It is absolutely clear that while the project of European Monetary Union was already there and actually quite well developed in summer 1989, the key moment is the month or two after the 9th of November 1989, when, while Mrs. Thatcher was denouncing and saying we must fight German unification futilely, François Mitterrand and his several colleagues of his, including the Italians in particular, were saying, well, we can't stop it, even though we're actually as worried as Margaret Thatcher is, but what price can we exact? What quid pro quo? And it's absolutely clear from the documents, the quid pro quo was to pin pin Helmut Kohl down to a timetable for European monetary union, but a very badly designed monetary union, because what they wanted, Mitterrand in particular, was a say over Germany's currency, the Deutschmark, which had been dictating their own economic policies. Helmut Kohl came back and quite rightly said, if you're going to have a monetary union, you need a political union, by which he meant above all a fiscal union. And they said, it was actually Mitterrand and Andreotti in particular, Giulio Andreotti, the Italian leader, said, no, that's not the idea. The idea is we get control of your money, you don't get control of our budgets, because that's how we do politics. And so emerged this profoundly flawed design of the Eurozone, a monetary union without fiscal union. Fundamental flaw. Second fundamental flaw, much too big, embracing much too diverse economies. And that's because it was a political project from the outset. So Italy had to be in there, France had to be in there, then Spain and Portugal had to be in there, and finally Greece had to be in there. This is a huge factor in the Brexit vote. Remember what I said about Britain's transactional approach to the European project. So the Daily Mail, in its leading article on the day of the vote, actually mentioned the desperate state of the South European economies and the level of unemployment in South European countries. It's a major factor. The third reason, coming out directly from the 9th of November 1989, my 13th in my 14-layer cake, was that while some globalization was already happening, that liberal triumph across Europe, the end of the Cold War, the end of the bipolar world, opened the door to globalization worldwide. I mean, there is some connection, surely, between what happened in India in the 1990s and the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet model and the Soviet Union. And there clearly is a sense in which this was, to some extent, an anti-globalization vote of the loosely speaking, native working class, small town and rural populations. Someone once talked about Rust Belt Brexiteers, and there is a sense in which the Rust Belt vote for Donald Trump and the Brexit vote from the post-industrial towns of northern England had much in common. And the vote was three-dimensional: economic, social, and cultural. Economic is obvious, social was about inequality, cultural is much more interesting and much more difficult for the left to address, because it is blame it on the bloody foreigners. The other, it is a vote against the speed of change. Altogether, cultural change, social liberalization, gay marriage, Muslims, you name it. The classic populist phrase is, I don't recognize my country anymore. It's a kind of, broadly speaking, white identity politics. And for the centre-left now trying to regroup and trying to come up with an answer, that's the most difficult part. So how do you speak to that without being xenophobic? And that brings me to my final cause in the layered cake, which is that the response to that genuine, and I say again, not necessarily racist or xenophobic, fear and anxiety and resentment in a large part of our electorates in Western democracies, in Western Europe and North America, was populism. And populism actually has quite a catchy demagogic formula, which is, this is pure Trump. We speak in the name of the people. I am your voice. Trump's case. The elites, the experts have let you down. Now I have direct legitimacy from the people, which trumps, the verb has acquired a new meaning, all other sources of legitimacy in a liberal democracy. Constitutional courts, courts of any kind, civil society, parliament, independent media. So you have the amazing spectacle of the Daily Mail when the High Court ruled that the opening of the Brexit negotiation, the Article 15 negotiation, had to go to Parliament, denouncing the judges, pictures of pink-faced, middle-aged men in wigs, as, I quote, enemies of the people. That's a horrifying moment, actually, in recent British history. Pure populism. So they're denouncing our independent judiciary for saying our independent parliament should have a vote on the Brexit negotiation, despite the fact that this is done in the name of parliamentary sovereignty. And then the other side of this is Nigel Farage saying on the night of the vote, this is a victory for, I quote, real people, ordinary people, decent people, thus implying that I and 48% of those who voted are neither ordinary nor decent nor indeed real, which I beg to differ, as do many of us, and blame it on the bloody foreigners. I mean, the emphasis on, and this is America, this is Turkey, this is Poland, this is Hungary, this is Italy, this is France. It is the populist moment. So there you have it, the reduced Shakespeare Company version of 14 Reasons, Causes of Brexit. Let me now turn more briefly to consequences, because of course we know much less about them, but I hope we can talk about them in discussion. So everybody on occasions like these quotes Zhou Enlai on the French Revolution, saying, I think it's a little too soon to say. Actually, Zhou Enlai didn't mean anything of the kind. Far from being this pearl of Oriental wisdom, for which it is always cited, the American interpreter at that conversation revealed recently that he was actually asked about the events in Paris in 1968, and this was the early 1970s. So it was an utterly banal comment. It is too soon to say. But people go on quoting it. I mean, even at the panel at Jaipur, actually Linda Colley quoted it, attributing it to Mao Zedong. Now, in this banal sense, it is too soon to say because it's very early days for such a big decision. What we can say is, I think, or among the things we can say are the following. First of all, the Brexiteers were more surprised than anyone. I have a great friend, a very distinguished scholar, who is a lifelong Eurosceptic and Brexiteer. He said he didn't for a moment think they could win, and he had never met a single Brexiteer friend who thought they could win. Michael Gove, This is attested by his rather gossipy journalist wife, who tells us everything that is going on in the Gove household in rather more detail than some of us want. But in this case, it's amusing because she tells us that Michael Gove was asleep when the BBC announced the result. She woke him up, and he replied with the immortal and very English remark, "Gosh, I suppose I'd better get up." Indeed. And then she quoted at him the great lines from The Italian Job, that wonderful movie. I don't know if some of you know it, where, do you remember the scene where they're meant to blow the doors off and they create this enormous explosion, nearly bring the house down? And Michael Caine says, "Yeah, we're only supposed to blow the bloody doors off." And this is a perfect summary of what they thought they were doing. They were only going to blow the bloody doors off. They weren't going to win. They were going to get great jobs in the new Cameron government. But they lost, and they thought, holy shit, now we actually have to do this thing. And you could see over the last 6 to 8 months that they had no bloody idea what they were doing. They really didn't. It's been the most extraordinary moment. And also they disagreed. The Brexit vote was an aggregation of many different views, and so it's very difficult then to say what had people voted for. You know what they'd voted against. We've set up rather surreally a department for exiting the European Union. It's like something out of Gilbert and Sullivan, I think, known as DEXU. But there are also 2 other departments, a new Department for International Trade, and of course the Foreign Office. 3 leading Brexiteers head these departments. That makes it more complicated. Every department of British government has been struggling to come up with its own Brexit plan. Sir Paul Jenkins, who's the former head of the government's legal services, said, I quote, "It is the biggest legal administrative challenge in our nation's peacetime history. To disentangle more than 40 years of intertwining of almost every aspect of law and administration is a formidable challenge." So it's actually understandable that it took a little time to work it out, to be fair. And after we've all been hammering away for the government to say, as you know, Theresa May has come out to at least partially answer some of the questions, and it appears that it's going to be, in the parlance of our time, a fairly hard Brexit in the view of the British government. That is to say, we're not going to stay in the single market because that would, as our partners have made clear, necessarily demand retaining freedom of movement. Even Norway has freedom of movement, and that's the key trade-off. It looks as if what they're going for is a kind of a la carte membership of the customs union, which is what Turkey is in. But and the point about that is Turkey can't negotiate its own free trade deals with anyone with whom the EU has free trade deals, and the EU has free trade deals with an awful lot of, important countries around the world. And so what the Brits want is to try and get out of that and have a la carte. But are our partners really going to be willing to give us a la carte membership of the customs union? Now, this goes to another point, which is, you're not going to believe this, but here is the authoritative summary of the basic strategy behind British policy for Brexit. An advisor to a minister, one of the Brexiteers, was photographed coming out of number 10 Downing Street with her handwritten notes, and fortunately, which were visible to the camera, right? So with a zoom, you can see what they are. Unfortunately, she had wonderful, very legible handwriting of a sort of top of the class person. Maybe I'll hand it round because it's very amusing. And so the authoritative summary of the key point in this actual planning meeting for Brexit read, I quote, "What's the model? ? Have cake and eat it." And maybe I'll pass it round so you can see this, because it is rather amusing if you could swing it back at the end. And that is still, in essence, this goes back to a joke by Boris Johnson, who said his attitude to cake is to have it and eat it. Well, can we be serious? This is Britain, a country renowned for its realism and pragmatism, its cool definition of the national interest, its negotiating skill. Have cake and eat it. But that is still fundamentally, and understandably, our continental partners are not minded to say you can have your cake and eat it. So we actually have a very tough negotiation ahead, and nobody knows what's going to come out of this. Nobody knows what are actually going to be the economic consequences. It is true that they have so far been less dramatic, significantly less dramatic than George Osborne and David Cameron warned. So hey, they exaggerated. Surprise, surprise. Is this what politicians do in election campaigns? People talk as if this is a sort of outrageous sin. I mean, sure, they exaggerated. But the pound has fallen from $1.50, where it was consistently for about the last 10 years, because I go every year to Stanford, so I know pretty well. It's crashed to $1.20, fell below $1.20. Okay, good for British exports, but how much do we have actually to export is the question. The Treasury estimates, and it's only an estimate, the bill over the next 5 years for lost revenues as a result of Brexit at £100 billion. That's not a small sum, even in a big economy and a big budget. But we will see. We will see. Nobody knows. It depends on the deal. But the crucial point to make about the deal is, of course, that it depends not only on us, but on them. And a negotiating position where you are negotiating with 27 other states, and by the way, the European Commission, so in a way it's 27 plus 1, and they all have to agree, and there is a deadline on this negotiation, otherwise you fall off a cliff, which is the phrase used even by the Prime Minister. Any of you who've studied negotiation will understand that's not a very favourable position for Britain. So we're not in a great negotiating position. The final vote is actually, this is a technicality, is by qualified majority voting. So there's some wiggle room there. Maybe one or two discontented states would have to shut up in the end, and Germany will come through. So I don't think the deal is necessarily disastrous. But we will not begin to know what this deal is going to be like until after the Dutch, French, and German elections, which are all this year, the most important being the German in the autumn, the most dangerous being the French, because I actually think Marine Le Pen could win, coming up through this year. So there's this narrow window. We activate Article 50 in March this year, so it's a 2-year time frame. German government gets together sometime at the end of 2017, because after a German election you always have leisurely, stately coalition negotiations. So you actually got a pretty narrow window, which is basically 2018, in which the heart of the negotiation is being done. And Theresa May has said there has to be a parliamentary vote on it. And that shortens the timetable too, because what the opposition in the British Parliament is now trying to do is to say this has to be a special kind of vote. It's not just yay or nay, it is we don't like it, go back and do better. So that's the crucial thing. Forget about the second referendum for now. That may come later down the road if we get a very, very bad deal and the economic consequences have become very visible and Labour's got a better leader and there's a growing feeling in the country that we made a big mistake. Then you might just possibly have a second referendum. I personally think it's unlikely, but we're not there yet. But parliamentary scrutiny is real. Happy to talk more about that in discussion, but, because there are many intricacies of it to it. However, I now want to move to wider consequences. Firstly, the wider consequences for the UK, the United Kingdom, in shorthand Britain. Namely, I think it is plausible to imagine that this vote could be, I don't say will be, but could be the beginning of the end of the United Kingdom. The Scottish position is absolutely clear. We are a nation. Yes, we voted narrowly against independence in our own referendum, but we voted very clearly to stay in the European Union. We want to stay in the single market. Now you're taking out of the single market. Nicola Sturgeon has said we may have our own referendum on it. Now, watch this space. I mean, she's going to be very, very cautious before she goes for it, because lose twice and you're done for. But if Britain gets a really bad deal, and some of our continental partners actually say we're going to fall off that cliff, there won't be a deal. I should have mentioned that the bill the European Commission is currently talking of presenting us for our exit, to reflect our, as it were, hypothecated obligations, of ongoing obligations, is £60 billion. That's 60 billion on top of 100 billion. That's a lot of money. At that point, it's conceivable that Scotland would go for it. The consequences for Ireland are dramatic. The Irish peace settlement is inextricably intertwined with being in the European Union and the European Convention on Human Rights, the Strasbourg Court. So you have to disentangle all of that. You have a 300-mile open land frontier, which for the last 100 years has been open either because we were both in Britain or because we were in the shared area between Ireland and Britain, or because we were both in the EU. What are you going to do about that? It's a dramatic challenge. And then there's England. What is England? You know, that question has not been answered fundamentally, politically, for arguably 300 years, since 1707. This England is deeply divided. There is a small country, which I call Londonia, which is Greater London, which overwhelmingly voted to remain. You have demonstrations in London for staying in the European Union. The other day I was going into Parliament Square and I couldn't get in. There's a demo, said the policeman. What's it about? For staying in Europe. Can you imagine in Britain people waving European flags in front of the British Parliament? So there's that very strong feeling against the north and to some extent the west of the country, the far west and Wales. It's rich against poor, rich for staying in, poor for leaving. It's cosmopolitan against nationalist, crudely put. It's educated versus less educated. It's young versus old. So, you know, the challenge even for England as England in working out what it is and where it wants to be is a really extraordinary one, because it hasn't been its own state, as I say, for 300 years plus. Rather amusingly, we have the speech that David Cameron was going to deliver when he'd won the referendum, because they released it to selected journalists. And its central highlighted sentence is, I quote, "We are on a long walk to a greater Britain," quote unquote. Well, I think we're on a long walk to a lesser Britain, frankly. In my last very few minutes, because I don't want to go on too long, I'm going to turn very briefly to what seems to me the most serious consequences of all, namely for the rest of Europe and the world. So first of all, the EU. Here we are in a union which is already facing multiple crises. The Eurozone crisis, the refugee crisis, the populism crisis, a terrorism crisis. Look at France, which is still in a state of emergency. The Ukraine crisis, the relations with Vladimir Putin's Russia, and its most important member for common foreign and security policy, bar none, because that is what Britain was, along with France and Germany, is about to leave the club. Huge blow to our external policy, blow to our self-confidence. It normalizes populism. Along with Trump, I was in Paris in December, and people said, yes, 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 Marine Le Pen's chances of winning have gone up significantly because of Brexit and Trump. They're doing it. The Brits, the Americans are doing it. You know, the Dutch are doing it. Why shouldn't we? And as I said, there are all these elections coming up. So watch out for that French presidential election. Also in terms of the EU, it is, and I think this is an important point, it undermines what I call the nimbus of irreversibility. So for all political communities and countries, it's very important to have some sense, even if it's a quite mythical sense, that this political community is advancing with the wheel of history, that it's on the side of history. And Europe has had that very powerfully. It's been one of the great keys to Europe's success. It's why so many people wanted to join. When a really major state, even such an awkward customer as Britain, actually leaves, that's a major blow. Brexit encourages Grexit, Frexit, Italexit, and all the other horrible neologisms. And by the way, at the same time, the Schengen control-free border area is also being reversed because they've restored border controls. So two very important ways in which the nimbus of irreversibly is being underlined. Let's talk about that in the discussion, but I would go so far as to say that in the very worst case, and this is the worst case, the 23rd of June 2016 could be the beginning of the end, not just of the UK, but also of the European Union. Finally, the European Union is without question the most institutionally developed and mature example of liberal international order on the face of the challenge. So this is also a larger blow to the state of liberal international order, which is not good. It's yet another blow in what I would call, with only a slight exaggeration, a global counter-revolution against liberalism in general and liberal internationalism in particular. Vladimir Putin, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Xi Jinping in China, and may I say, Mr. Modi in India, who I think is genuinely, that's not a partisan or polemical statement. I think it's a genuinely analytical one. There is something, it happens sometimes in history that you get waves and counterwaves, and I think this is a counterwave. The Kaczynskis in Poland, Viktor Orban in Hungary, so we can go on. So that for we, or at least us, liberals and liberal internationalists, this is a moment of really historic challenge, and finding out how you respond to that challenge, putting together the package which has to appeal to those very, very large chunks of our electorate who have been disillusioned with what has been called liberalism, including neoliberalism in economic policy, who have not been happy with the consequence of the liberalizations, including the rapidity of change, the cosmopolitanism which many of us love. Finding that package, domestically and internationally, is, I think, going to be, a great struggle for all of us, and it's not going to be a struggle for the next 6 months or a year, it's the next 10 years at least. May I finish by saying that I think, and this is why I'm very interested to hear all your views, India is a very interesting place to look at this, not just at the particular issue of Brexit. And I have to say, our Brexit panel at Jaipur, I nearly suffocated. It was an unbelievable, massive turnout, amazing interest. I don't quite know why, but clearly there is a great interest and appetite to know. So that's you looking at us, but also if you talk to the Brexiteers, their vision of a great new global, sovereign, free, imperial, neo-imperial, Walter Raleigh-esque, neo-Elizabethan Britain has India right at the center. We're going to be able to forge this great new special relationship with India. Forget about little Germany. We don't need Germany. We've got India. And so Theresa May comes to Bombay, and I gather it didn't go altogether well. But nonetheless, I think there is an interesting question, what possibilities. But of course, what Theresa May would have to acknowledge is, and perhaps I'll end with this, it's not terribly clever to say, we love you. This is our new special relationship. But whatever you do, please don't send your children to study at our universities. The number of visas given to Indian students, I think I'm correct to say, is nearly halved. I don't think that's very clever. So the sort of fundamental anti-immigration, and by the way, it is totally absurd to count our students as immigrants, it's ridiculous, it comes up against a certain contradiction here. But anyway, so it's very, very interesting to see this from the Indian point of view, and I look forward very much to the discussion. Thank you.